tells him things, because the king is someone who pays attention. Because the king who doesn't pay attention is a tyrant. And then the wind is blowing through the king's hair because the wind is spirit. And so the king is also something that's associated with the everlasting spirit. Pneuma. Pneuma is the breath of air, and it's also the essence of life from an archetypal perspective. So to be inspired is like respiring. To be inspired is to take in spirit. And the kind of spirit that the king takes in is associated with the image of the wind. Now, you got to look at his face. You remember before I was saying, because the animators do a very good job of this, they gave him a very mature face. And a mature face is something out of which something is coming instead of something into which something is coming. And you'll see that the king, Mufasa, is always looking like this. He's very intent and focused and intimidating. Whereas his son, right up until he becomes initiated, is like this, always. As soon as he becomes initiated, and I'll show you that in the film, his face hardens. And it isn't until his face hardens that he can go back and fight Scar, who's basically a figure of the shadow. Now originally this character, Rafiki, was going to be one of those typical sort of Disney sidekick buffoons. That didn't work out so well in the narrative, and he ended up as a symbol of the self instead. And Rafiki is obviously a shaman, and he's the part of the psyche that guides its transformation. So here's another way of looking at the self. It's a very interesting idea. So, you know, as you go through life, there's going to be triumphs and then catastrophes, and when there's a catastrophe, the psyche falls apart, and then maybe it gathers its resources back together and pulls itself together. It's going like this. Well, Jung would say the self is what's guiding that process. So the ego feels it like this. So that's triumph and catastrophe, or tragedy and comedy. But the self is the thing that's underneath all of it, allowing those transformations to take place. And that's Rafiki, and that's why he's associated as well with the sun. So, and he's a good king because he's in touch with the self. So that makes him not something that's either serving his persona or his ego. But you could say that what he's serving is a manner of ruling that allows for the appropriate amount of stability and transformation to take place in the kingdom so that it remains stable but also adapting to change. And the king is guided in that by the little bird who tells him what's going on in those places he can't see. Now that's clearly a Madonna and child image. And the reason for that is quite simple. I mean, you might think, well, why would the idea of the Madonna and child, which by the way is a far older idea than the Christian representation of it. There's lots of figures of Madonnas and Madonnas and children? Yeah. In ancient Egyptian art, for example, and that would be Isis with Horus. Well, the reason that that's an archetype is because any society who doesn't regard the dyad of mother and infant as something sacred, which would mean of highest value, is doomed, obviously. Because without that being held as a value, the society will cease to propagate, and that will be the end of it. So if society isn't structured so that that dyad is up among the highest of values, then the society has become ungovernably corrupt.